Morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you're joining us from today. My name is Eric Kimberling. We're doing our Tuesday live stream where we talk about things related to digital transformation. In this podcast / live stream, we cover stuff related to digital strategy, change management, project management, software evaluation, implementation, project management, data, architecture, all the stuff related to digital transformation is the stuff that we cover in these Tuesday live streams. We do these Tuesday live streams live on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And we do it live as a way to engage the audience in our podcast. So this recording actually becomes part of our weekly Transformation Ground Control podcast, which comes out every Wednesday morning on all the audio podcast platforms like Amazon, Spotify, Pandora, as well as YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook. So you're getting to see how the sausage is made, and you're getting to be part of the live podcast production, if you will. So thanks for being here today. I'm going to introduce our guest in just a moment, but before I introduce him, I'll tell you what the topic is. What I thought we'd do today is have Khalid on the show to talk about just consulting stuff in general and digital transformation stuff in general. We're going to kind of put him on the hot seat. We called this we titled this session Consultant Hot Seat, and this is the first time we've tried it. And I thought rather than try to pick one specific topic, which I usually do, I usually have one topic that we sort of dive deep into. I thought this time we'd do a little different and just ask you some general stuff about, or ask Khalid. I won't say you because I haven't introduced you yet, Khalid, but I'll introduce you here in a second. But I thought we'd cover some general stuff related to digital transformation, some of his lessons learned so far from being on the Thirdstage team. We'll cover some career stuff and really just anything the audience wants to talk about as it relates to transformation. You have two pretty seasoned consultants on the phone or on the live stream here today. So we'll take whatever questions you've got. So we encourage you to chime in with questions at any point, whatever stream you're watching from, whether it's LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, or Twitter, or Stitch. We're on Stitch as well. Be sure to chime in with any questions you have along the way. We're keeping an eye on all the chats right here, all the streams right here as we talk. But before I introduce our guest, if you could just drop in the chat where you're joining us from today. I always love to see where the audience is and what part of the world you're in. So just tell us what city or country you're joining from, if you don't mind. That gives us a good sense of who you all are, and I'd love to hear from you here as we get started. So I'll give you a little bit of background on what we're going to cover today. But before we sort of dive into these questions, I thought I would introduce Khalid Morris. Khalid is a director of strategy and transformation at Thirdstage. He's relatively new to Thirdstage, just within the last few months, or he started late last year. I'll let him talk about his background, but he and I have actually worked together over the course of 10 years or so. So he may be new to the company, but he's someone that I know pretty well over the years. So that being said, Khalid, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
Yeah, good to have you. And you've been on our podcast before. I think one other time you were on the Transformation Ground Control podcast talking about the analogy between sports and winning and digital transformation and change in general. So what I wanted to do today, though, is we were going to talk about this whole topic of just sort of like a consultant hot seat. We're putting you in the hot seat, although at the end of the day, I think you and I are both going to be in the hot seat. Hopefully, if things go well, the audience will put us both in the hot seat and we can sort of answer their questions. But before we do that, maybe just tell us a little bit about yourself. What do you do here at Thirdstage? What's your background and upbringing? Just sort of that high level overview of who you are.
Sure. My background is actually finance. I grew up in Los Angeles, California, South Central Los Angeles, California to be exact. I played sports. As you well know, and I ended up kind of going to school away from California, away from Los Angeles in Louisiana, and I really was interested in finance. I was always a good math student, and I settled on business and I went more economics and math, and so I came out, doing accounting, financial analytics, and that sort of thing. And so that's always my base. I always think of myself that way, as even though we're doing so much in the tech space now, I've always thought of myself more as a financial guy. And I did that for a number of years before I moved here to Denver, to attend the University of Denver, where I actually went to pursue more finance, more real estate. I actually went for real estate. I love the real estate program at the University of Denver. So I studied real estate and construction management at DU, and I also got my MBA. And I thought I was going into real estate development until I met you, and you kind of pulled me more along that
You're welcome.
consulting line. It was a tough space in the real estate world at the time with Lehman Brothers and the likes, and I've been sort of doing consulting ever since. That was yeah, we're getting old here, but damn near 20 years ago. So it's been a great ride. I've been doing it across ERP, across business intelligence, across strategic planning, budgeting, forecasting, that sort of thing. So I've been exposed to the back ends of transactional databases, analytical databases, being a part of building out some of those models to really drive different parts of business needs. And so it's been a pretty broad experience, and I've been able to do it at some great consulting groups, obviously, here at Thirdstage, and previously with you, but also even larger groups like the Accentures of the world, and even at the software level, kind of working with a bunch of different software groups and constantly being exposed. So for me, it's been a ride. I've kind of gone from more of a functional resource to a technical resource to now here at Thirdstage being able to really work in a more advisory capacity and really help clients through making some of these critical decisions, because it's amazing how you make a decision like, oh, we want to move in one ERP system or the other, and the ramifications of that. It's I guess equivalent to what college you're going to go to or what major you're deciding to have, and the ramifications of that as it relates to job market, as it relates to all of these other dominoes that sort of fall. Well, that's sort of what happens when you make a technology decision, and you make a bad decision. It sort of lives with you for a very long time. And so it's really great to be able to work with companies early and give them that kind of strategic insight and really help them navigate their journeys. And it's good to kind of see them grow and develop as a result.
Yeah. And you've got a pretty broad background, as you're alluding to here, not just in terms of different industries and verticals you've worked in, but as you alluded to as well, you have sort of a unique mix between that strategy, sort of that strategic view of consulting, as well as down in the weeds with the technical aspects of business intelligence and data and some of the things we'll get to. And I actually want to come back to that point, because I think that's a really important point that gives you a pretty unique perspective that a lot of us don't have, sort of that high level and low level consulting experience. So I think you alluded to this a little bit, but I want to go a little bit deeper into it, is when you look at your finance and real estate background, I know you may try to blame me for this, and I think you already did, but what made you shift from finance and real estate to consulting? I know that was around the time you and I met, and then I think I may have been involved in trying to convince you to do consulting at the time, but what ultimately led you to decide that, hey, I want to try this consulting thing way back when?
Well, originally it was opportunity. The opportunities were thin, and it is just the real estate market was extremely thin, and I wasn't banking on that. You don't foresee a collapse of an industry, and when that Lehman Brothers trigger sort of happened, and the financial world started to sort of shrink in that way, it was a dramatic impact on the real estate market. There was no construction projects. There were no real estate projects. I had one real estate development opportunity, and I also had another quasi opportunity that I was working through coming out of DU, and both opportunities weren't that great, and the options were sort of getting thin. So it was a real opportunity to kind of do some consulting. I was looking for that in that I needed something, and I didn't really expect to have longevity in what it was. Funny enough, the link between us and kind of getting in the consulting world was built around finance, and the need at that time. You kind of had this project, and you really needed some financial acumen. You needed someone to be a liaison for the finance group. You needed someone to talk to those people who understood their language, and since that was my background, that part was easy for me. That's kind of the way it started. But what I learned was IT and real estate have a lot of parallels as it relates to project management. You can really run. A lot of real estate projects run almost like a waterfall, uh, implementation, and so when I sort of got submerged into the rhythm of technical development, almost felt familiar. It felt a lot of the things I love about real estate development is nothing is there, and you're working through a development cycle to sort of build something. You're working, whether it's a blight zone or a vacant land or an unused building, sort of you get an opportunity to change something. And the same is happening on technology. Nothing is there. You're sort of designing from scratch. And so you're building, and there's so many sort of indirect hidden ramifications as it relates to business processes and the links there that you're making a significant change in the application of a business, the function of a business. And that part for me was thrilling. So I ended up getting a lot of thrill out of working with technical projects and accomplishing or completing some of these implementation deliveries in the same way that, and it was a shorter cycle because real estate will take you years. Technical development can be shorter cycles depending on what you're doing. So that's kind of, I guess, what sort of changed. So when the real estate market came back around, I kind of was like, I'm good. I kind of can do this. I kind of enjoy where I'm going with career, and just sort of start to do some real estate stuff on the side.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a good balance for sure. And I think it's a good reminder how important that real world experience is and that real world understanding is to be a good consultant.
Yeah.
And before I jump into a sort of a career related question or a follow-up career related question, I want to just turn back to the audience here and just sort of get to some of the comments we have here. I had asked the question, where are you all joining from today? And a lot of you commented. And just to give everyone a sense of where people are joining from across the 4 or 5 live streams that we're streaming to, we've got someone from Malcolm from the UK, Photon from London, Jerry from Toronto, Kyler's joining us from Denver, an unknown user from Johannesburg, South Africa, Ed from Ghana, Deborah from France, Parisa from Parker, got someone from the Netherlands, Charlotte, London, Paris again, Toronto. So a lot of global audience here today. So really appreciate everyone joining. We also have Sam Graham joining from Spain, and Sam's one of my favorite guests because he's very engaged with our content. And also wanted to give a special hello to Christian, who's joining from Vietnam. This is his first time listening to a live stream. So thanks for being here today, Christian. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope we live up to your expectations. Thanks for trying out one of our live streams for the first time. And then here's just an interesting question that you might, or it's not really a question, it's more of a comment that you might find interesting, Khalid, from YouTube. I want to get into real estate development too, but want to build my career in consulting first and save up my income. Is that sort of what you did? Did you kind of use consulting as a way to generate income that you could then invest in real estate? Or I don't want to get too far into the real estate world, but
kind of, it definitely was. Consulting income was good. It was different. I was the most I made when I started to go in consulting. And if you're smart about your finances, you can save a little bit. So that happened. I mean, the real estate market is a lot different now than it was then. So I think it was a lot easier to do more of certainly the kind of investments I was doing or the moves that I was making real estate wise then. But now it might be a little bit harder. But yeah, you certainly can do that. It would just replace consulting with anything, right? You can save, kind of make plans, long-term plans to sort of save to get to a certain amount, and then invest when you sort of reach your target, or you have enough to sort of play in that sandbox.
Yeah, yep, that's good advice. And maybe another question for the audience here is, what field are you in? Are you a consultant? Are you, do you work for industry? What industry are you in? I'd love to hear from all of you sort of what you do, just to give us a sense of what sorts of industries you all work in. So just drop in the chat if you don't mind. What is it you do? What industry are you in? What's your role? What are you looking to do? Anything you want to share with us would be super interesting and helpful there. So back to the questions I had, and then I'll shift. I'm going to kind of go back and forth between questions I have and then questions from the live audience here. The question I had is, how is working at a company like Thirdstage different from working at some of the really big consulting firms? And you didn't mention any. I don't think you mentioned specific names, but you've worked for a couple of the really big, larger,
Yeah.
well-known consulting firms, and we're a smaller consulting firm of 50 people versus 50,000 or hundreds of thousands of people that work at some of these bigger firms you've worked at. So how is it different, working at Thirdstage or a smaller firm like Thirdstage versus one of the big guys?
I think it's different in two major ways. Well, potentially three, but I think two significant. One is the kind of client. So the clients that we work on here at Thirdstage, even our large clients, are very different than the kind of clients that you'd work with, like in a Big Four. Once you're in the Big Four world, your clients are ginormous. They're almost little governments, and the projects are extremely complicated as a result. And you're on these huge teams where one project might have 40, 50 people kind of working, and it turns into a subculture on the project itself, to where you got to deal with your own, just like you have to deal with sort of the client. And so there's a degree of complexity there. There's a degree of culture there that can be, those projects are long, and it can, in some cases, be toxic. In other cases, sort of, it pushes you because there's a certain level of complexity that it extends beyond the application's bandwidth. Sometimes those choices are bad. So you might have an application that you're trying to build is really not a good fit for that organization. And so the projects are just all complicated. Like, they're just all extremely complicated with, just tons of difficulty around with respect to trying to fit, a square peg in a circle, or something like that. So you have challenges there. And I think you also here, with a smaller company, you have more engagement. So I think the engagement points, I think, at larger companies are different. You don't have the same opportunity to build the kind of relationship with a client. Our clients here at Thirdstage are, we just have great relationships, and it's not really specific to like one person. It'll just be, most of the projects that I've been on here at the small level, you get an opportunity to really talk a client through, to really work with the client through their decision-making process and really help them get to where they need to be, because that's the end target. It's like we're all pushing in a window here that sort of lends to client making such and such type of decision. And it's not really like that with large companies. You don't get those opportunities. It's not about engagement. It's about reaction. So they're very, very different experiences. But if you're more into relationships and you're more into end game and benefit to the client, then the smaller kind of consulting world kind of works more. So for me, it's more satisfying than kind of with the larger companies where you're just submerged in politics and grievance and bureaucracy and complexity, and you just feel like you're fighting a battle every single day.
Yeah, and you and I both have experience with some of the big firms, but your experience is more recent and probably more relevant. And I think you spent more time at these larger firms than I did. I didn't last very long, so but you bring up a really interesting point that I've never really thought about it or articulated in that way that you just said, around how you didn't say this part, but digital transformations, if you back up, transformations are just complex no matter who it is, like no matter what kind of company it is, right, that you work for, or no matter what kind of consulting partner you work with. So the last thing you want to do is further complicate things by bringing in your own internal politics and your own complexities as a consulting firm. And I think that's what happens with a lot of these bigger firms is, I remember back early in my career, just the amount of time we spent just dealing with internal stuff and just internal politics and jockeying and positioning. By the way, we're billing our clients for all this time too, which is super unethical in my opinion. But so you're dealing with your own internal garbage and you're billing clients for that, and you're just adding to the complexity. But I'm curious to hear, though, you didn't mention this directly, but I think you're sort of circling it a little bit. But the whole idea of independence. I know you talked about not wanting to fit a square peg into a round hole with technology or the solutions that you're developing. But how does independence or bias, Thirdstage being sort of the independent option, there's bias involved in other, some of these larger firms. How does that all factor into transformation and just your overall experience as a consultant?
When you're on the delivery side, everything is sort of handed to you. So you get pulled into projects. You're either called by some senior director somewhere and say, hey, we want you to lead this work stream, or do this on this project engagement, and this is what we're doing. We are implementing this application for this particular client, and we would like you to do it. So there's no conversation about what makes sense, what doesn't necessarily make sense. It is just handed to you, almost like a briefcase, and then you go do it. And I've never been on, I don't know about you in your Big Four experience, I've never been on a project with any of those with any client at a Big Four company where I thought to myself, this is the right application for this client. Never.
Yeah.
It has always been, why would this client choose this application for what they need to do? So it almost was no thought, done behind what this digital strategy is and how it meshes. It's, you're working with some department or some component of this huge behemoth, and you're trying to implement something that doesn't fit well. So you end up having to do customizations. You end up having to go outside of the depth of the application in order to do a bunch of things that the application was never built to do. And so that's where you kind of get into that. And then you mesh that with a army of people, whether it's 40, 50 people. The idea that they like each other is funny. They don't. You have 50 people on these projects, and clients don't think about this because they're like, well, we're paying this group. And no, they can't stand each other for whatever reason. Internal politics, there's some sort of ladder that they're chasing or whatever. And so it really turns toxic. And it, to your point, it makes something that's already difficult way more difficult. And that's where it just becomes a drain, and it's hard to sort of live or be sustainable in those kind of environments.
Yeah, it is highly stressful, and I think that's why most people, only last. I think the average is about 2 years that people last.
Like 2, 3 at the most. That was about my limit. After that point, you just start looking for the window to jump out of.
Right. Right. Your story about how, why are we forcing this technology into this situation that it doesn't work for? It reminds me of my first project was a really long project with a really big Fortune 500 company that makes, at the time, they made large cabinets of telco equipment. So they were highly tailored. They're cabinets with electronic equipment that would go into it, and each piece of the equipment was serialized, so that you had this whole serialization hierarchy that you had to manage to. And they were trying to implement SAP, and SAP at the time couldn't handle that serialization hierarchy. I think it's better at it now. But I remember we did all this re-engineering and customization of the software. And to your point, it got to the point where we were spending so much time and money trying to fix this one problem that you're like, why are we force fitting this technology? Has anyone thought about some other solution that might be better? It didn't even occur to us because we were an SAP partner and our job was to implement SAP. And you see that all the time, that dynamic of,
after our initial kind of engagement, I went on and I was working with this telecom group, and this told me everything. This really helped shape my understanding of what was happening in the industry. They spent $5 million to answer a question that we already gave them the answer to, as it relates to the application. It was essentially, they wanted to know if one application could do something that another application already did. And we said, no, it can't. And I said, well, we won't know for certain unless we do all of this work and blah, 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 blah. And they said, okay, well, let's go through that work. Well, guess what the answer was? Yeah, no, we definitely can. So why spend that much money to kind of go through that particular answer? And then after we gave them that answer, they ended up going with the same application that we told them wouldn't work. So to no surprise, it didn't work. So that gets to that fit. Like, are we trying to solve the problem here? Are we actually trying to understand what is going to be the right technical fit and kind of move from there? Or are we just spending money for no reason, right? And I think that those are your two options. And oftentimes there's competing interests where you have a slice of an organization, maybe the finance group, that thinks about it one way, and you have an executive team that thinks about it another way. And there's no real alignment between the different factions. So that's where it's very, very important that you have an aligned digital strategy and that everybody understands what we're trying to accomplish here. If that's the case, then you can make technological decisions that are, financially efficient for your organization, that have long-term viability, and that meet the needs of your organization. I mean, because that should be the goal. No one's spending money to spend it. Otherwise, you end up bringing one part, doesn't work with another part. It's like you end up having this car with like all of these different parts in it, and it struggles. It's like, yeah, you have a Ferrari engine with some, Honda tires and, some, an 18-wheeler brake pads. It's like, what are we doing here? What kind of car is this? And why? And what do you need this car to do? So, I think that organizations can get a lot smarter and really start with that technical strategy and make sure everyone's on the same page. If that means getting, socializing, getting the buy-in and talking to the organization to understanding what their goals are, what your goals are, and making sure all of those things are aligned before you make technological decisions, then go do that. Then decide on what technology makes the most sense for your organization.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's sound advice. And actually, there's some questions coming in that's more related to kind of how to move forward with transformations and some questions specific to transformation in general. But before I get to that one, I want to get to a couple career related things, and then we'll shift gears to the more general digital transformation discussion. But just to sort of come back to the audience here, some of the responses to the question I had, which is, what do you do? What industry are you all in? Eric is a recruiter for tech consultants. He's watching on LinkedIn. We have Sean, data security and digital transformation. We have Sweta, who's working in HCM tech consulting, looking to shift into digital transformation consulting, maybe more of a broader digital transformation purview or role. We have Mahmoud, who's an ERP consultant. We have Deborah in Paris, who's a recently certified Oracle specialized with background in operations project management. Congratulations, Deborah. I've actually had a chance to meet Deborah when I was in Paris a few weeks ago. So very good consultant caliber type person if anyone's interested. And actually, I'm going to come back to a question that I saw somewhere here from Deborah, and here it is. So this question is from Deborah on LinkedIn, which is, how do we find opportunities with smaller companies? Most job offers I see are with the big consulting firms. So do you have any thoughts on that, Khalid? I know you and I had a relationship that sort of led to you joining my two smaller firms over the years. But what in general, what advice would you have for someone who maybe doesn't want to look at the big firms, or maybe they just want to look at their options with smaller firms? How would you recommend they?
I mean, there are tiers. I guess as you study the industry, you'll see the tiers. I mean, there's only really 4 or 5 big consulting firms that we're sort of talking about, that big 4 sort of space. There's those guys kind of, and then there's a bunch of mid-level consulting companies, and there's smaller ones. So, understanding the tiers and the organizations, just sort of doing research. And when you start doing research in the consulting field that you're looking for, you're going to see those consulting groups start to sort of pop up, bubble up. And those opportunities nowadays, especially on the independent side, you can start lending yourself. So in some spaces, you can even start to lend your service on a contractual basis for the things that you do well. So that's also an option. So there's tiers though. And as you start to kind of put your name out there, as you start to sort of research the fields, I think that's where you'll sort of get those names there. Because there's so many different ones, I don't know that I can specifically point out one thing, especially at the mid-level and at the small. But I think it'll be more specific to what you're trying to do in consulting.
Yeah. Yeah. And one other thought I have too is, LinkedIn is such a powerful tool for meeting or finding companies and people within the companies that are making hiring decisions. So that if you reach out to people on LinkedIn and that's a great tool. But one thing I will say is, I get a ton of emails every day on LinkedIn and through email that I just don't have time to respond to or even look at in some cases. People that want jobs or people that are interested in doing work for us. And the thing that catches my attention though is, first of all, persistence. If someone that emails me once never emails me again, it's probably going to get lost in the shuffle. But someone that emails me multiple times, not in a harassing kind of a way, but more like, hey, just want to make sure you saw my note. I'm really interested in just continuous follow-up in a eager way. That's something you look for when you're hiring. But also, looking for other ways to engage with that person on social media. I've had people, including someone who's on this live stream here today, who reached out to me before, and then we engaged on social media. She would come to events and like stuff and comment on stuff. So she just sort of like was on my radar because I keep seeing her name and I keep seeing that she's commenting on stuff and she's in my live streams. And so there's stuff like that where that will get attention of your of people you might be trying to join. And also, one other thing of advice I'd have is just offer to help, like offer to be, instead of saying, hey, I want a really high salary job and I want you to pay me a ton of money, make it more about like how you want to help the company. And maybe it's helping on a part-time basis, on a contract basis, low risk to the company, or maybe you want to be an intern and just sort of learn a little bit more and just get involved in some way. So if you can kind of make it low risk and low pressure to the person that you're reaching out to, I think that's another word of advice I'd have, just as someone who does get inundated with inquiries about jobs and whatnot. So that's good advice. Okay. So I want to shift gears a little bit and go to a more of a we're going to shift gears maybe and go a little bit more into digital transformation as a whole. And we can always come back to career stuff as well. I don't mean to cut that off because I know a lot of you on the live stream are interested in that. But there is a question that I had here that I'm trying to find. We have a lot of really good comments here, so thank you for all the engagement. The only bad news is now it's hard for me to go back and find the comments I wanted. Okay, here's a question I wanted to get to, Khalid. I want to see what you think here. This is from Lawrence on LinkedIn, and he asked the question of, I work in a company with a very old ERP system and no CRM system. Would you advise to first implement CRM or go straight all the way digital immediately?
I would advise that when you say work for, obviously, the role with the organization matters here. But strategically, you got to get your strategy down first. When you say that there's no CRM system there, I get that, right? What functions sort of are driving that? Is there a reason sort of behind that is my first trigger point. But more broadly, what the strategic goals of the organization are. It could be as simple as, think about it this way. One organization may want a lean IT department. Another organization may want a more development-centric organization that can manage their IT and the likes. Those are two completely different directions as it relates to applications. So sure, you can go to the CRM. You can go down the CRM path and start looking for tools that work. But how does that line up with the strategic direction of the overall organization and what they want to do? If the organization is looking for those lean staffs on the IT side, then obviously the cloud direction is going to make a lot of sense, where they don't have to do a lot of that management. That's going to cut off a bunch of CRM systems right there. That's going to cut off a bunch of ERP systems right there, right? Versus, well, we want to be a little more hands-on because we have skill here, and maybe they have skill in one language versus the other. Maybe they have a bunch of .NET guys. Maybe they don't. Maybe so all of that matters when you're really getting to what technology should I choose. So to be honest with you, when you need to make a technology choice, it may sound counterintuitive, but when you need to make a technology choice, you need to go to the business to go figure out, what are we trying to accomplish here? What are we trying to do? Because you want to narrow the field of technology that you have to choose from. You have tens of thousands of options out there. And it's almost like you go to a grocery store and you have, all kind of SKUs. Yes, you can buy everything in the store, but it does matter what you want to eat tonight, right? Like, do you want Mexican food or do you want Italian food? Like, now you sort of narrowed the window to foods that make sense for you. And so really going to the business and understanding what are we trying to accomplish, where are we trying to go with our technology needs here over a short window, starts to tell you the technologies that make the most sense. Because once you understand that, the CRM choices start to bubble up, the ERP choices start to bubble up. Maybe those choices have CRM systems that line up to your priorities. Maybe they don't. If they don't, they'll have some integration ties that can do, but the entire time, the focus isn't necessarily which applications you're buying. It's more so what the business functions are and how that relates or how that solves or how your technology choices solve those business functions.
Yeah, makes total sense. And I think, one thing there too is you have to find the right balance between having an overall vision and plan and strategy, and then assuming that, and I'm not sure, I might be reading too much between the lines of the question Lawrence had, which is, if you want to get immediate value faster than it might take to go through a whole full-blown digital transformation, you can have that broad, big picture strategy and roadmap, and then go implement quickly pieces of that. But as long as you're doing so in the context of what your overall strategy is, otherwise you end up just implementing something and you're sort of aimlessly going off in a random direction. And someday, it may be in a year or 10 years, but someday, probably sooner than later, you're going to find that you've got this hodgepodge of technology that no one's really thought through and no one's really planned for. So if you can have an overarching strategy, but then go implement quickly, that's usually, the best path to do that.
Right. Exactly. And then the net result of kind of having those hodgepodge of systems is you're overspending. Just at the end of the day, you end up overspending on technology, and not just technology, personnel, everything else. And so there are ramifications to sort of having this sort of unstrategic, if you will. It's not a word, but by just sort of aimlessly going about buying random technology to solve gaps in your company. There's a price for that, and that's what I think you should avoid.
Right. Now, how about this? Here's a super technical question, and if you don't just give you an eject button on this question,
Sure.
you could answer for it. I'll try to answer. But
it's perfectly fine.
Can you enlighten us about blockchain integration during digital transformation? What is it, and is it a good idea?
Well,
so
I would
topic, but let's try to see if we can answer it here.
I would say that goes back to your strategy. I mean, when you think about blockchains, they're really just handshakes, and that's really what integration is. So, I think the blockchain of it all is sort of a separate deal to digital transformation of it all. Because when you think of digital transformation, it's an execution of whatever your strategy is. And so now we got to kind of get into the strategy of, are we doing this for privacy? Are we sort of, are we trying to be off the grid here as it relates to sort of, implementing something like a blockchain? Why are we implementing something like a blockchain? Blockchain is just a platform, and there's sort of many different platforms out there. You can go a million different ways with what that is. I used to do a lot of custom development too. So when you work with a blank canvas and you sort of start with, okay, what do we want to do? You're not starting with, because what do we want to do is the transformation, but you're not starting with, I want to do blockchain. That's not how you start the conversation. You start the conversation with what your needs are. You start the conversation with what you're trying to accomplish. You're drawing circles to say this, we would like to do this, here, and these are the ways that we would like to do it. Once you kind of get that down, you get that clarity down, then things like the technology application to fit that particular model start to make sense. Then it becomes a discussion of, blockchain will be great here. It will be great here because this is what we're doing, right? And blockchain is maybe a great economical way of sort of doing that, right? Through channels that are out there to do it. Now, maybe it's not. Maybe there is a different way or more efficient way. So there's so many different integration paths. Now, I've done a ton of integration. There's so many different integration tools nowadays, like a gazillion. That it when you're really trying to tie applications together, when you're trying to tie data together, for me, it just becomes more about not talking about tech. I think to be redundant with this conversation, but again, I get that it sounds counterintuitive, but to really solve a technology question, and maybe I have this perspective because I wasn't always technical, and so it really helped me to sort of break this down and first understand that things don't start at the technical level. Things get to the technical level once you get into your use cases and the application of what you're trying to do functional. That's where it starts. That's where transformation starts. The belly of transformation is in outlining what you're trying to do functionally. Then you kind of can get into, okay, well, I have some complicated wants here, desires here, and these complicated desires require a platform like blockchain or a platform like something else. It might be .NET. It might be, who knows? So there's so many different ways to accomplish it. And the beauty in technology today is that it's so developed, so diverse, and there's so many different ways to sort of do things that you can probably do whatever you want. It's more so just about that. And I know from a technical end, that's what those technical custom development or even regular package development, everyone wants to know, what do you want me to do? They're not asking you for advice on whether or not to implement blockchain versus something else. They just want the suite of requirements. Like, what do you want me to do? Help me see what I need to do here. And then they'll go ahead and do it. And so you got to think about digital transformation from a business perspective first, not a technology perspective.
Yeah. And I know and I totally agree with that. If you let your business drive whether or not you need blockchain or any other technology for that matter, that's typically the way to do it. In blockchain, at least within large scale enterprise digital transformations, the use cases are fairly limited right now. I think someday, maybe in 5 or 10 years, blockchain will probably be a lot more mainstream, if you will. But for now, we're seeing sort of early signs of adoption in really highly complex supply chains like food and beverage or pharmaceutical, for example,
right.
Where that traceability is so important.
Yeah.
Those handshakes throughout the entire supply chain, you've got to track all that, and blockchain is a great technology to do that. But I think a lot of us, consultants and software vendors included, are trying to figure out how could it fit into these enterprises, and what are some of the use cases. But I think the key is, the key question you have to ask yourself when it comes to blockchain or any emerging technology is, A, does it fit with your strategy, and is it the right technology? And B, is it mature and proven enough for your business? If you're a super risk adverse follower, which isn't a bad thing, but if you're a risk adverse organization, you probably don't want to be one of the first to try the whole blockchain thing out. But if you're a highly aggressive risk, you're open to risk, and you're a tech company or whatever, then blockchain could be a good option. It's just a matter of aligning with what your strategy and culture is.
Yeah, it will go back to customized sort of traceability and whether or not you're comfortable managing that. And there are other ways to manage traceability.
Right.
So once you get into the belly of what you need, you'll look at a bunch of options. Blockchain will just be one. It'll just be one of the options, and it might not make sense once you kind of get into that, because at the end of the day, if all you really want is that, then why would you go the more complicated route, or why would you go the route that you can't have the resources to sort of manage it, or why wouldn't you go with the route that is easiest? Maybe you also have other requirements in addition to traceability, or you may have requirements that center around. We just talked about human resources, and we talked a little bit about wanting a lean organization versus a more development centric organization. All of that stuff matters. It's not one thing, and those are business questions. Those are not technical questions. And I think one of the biggest mistakes that a lot of organizations make is they think these things are IT projects, and they're not. I mean, digital transformation is not a IT project. It is a business initiative. It's a business exercise, and you got to think about it from that route. And once you start thinking about it that route, the answers to the questions that you present start to become easy.
Yeah. Very, very well said. Now I'm going to ask one last question, because you and I both have hard stops at a quarter past the hour here. But so I want to ask, actually, it's two questions. I'm going to try to wrap it into one. They're two audience questions here. And I want to thank the audience, first of all, because if you've ever been on my live streams podcast, I cannot for the life of me get through one of those sessions without somehow bringing up change management or people. But I didn't have to do it this time because the audience did it for me. So now, not just me that's thinking all crazy about this people and change management stuff. So I'm going to show you two questions, Khalid, and maybe we can sort of summarize this as sort of the best we can at a high level. But the first, call it part A of the question, is how do you address the people part of transformation? Most of the companies are so focused on the tech and solving a problem and not the culture shift that is truly necessary. And to hold that thought while you're thinking about that, Khalid, because there's a follow-up here that sort of fits in with that. And this is from Christian over on YouTube, who asked the question, any recommendations on how to get aligned with all the stakeholders, running a global implementation with global teams in the US and China? So I guess those are two sort of different questions, but it all comes back to the question of how do you manage change on a global scale across an entire enterprise, especially if you're in multiple countries, multiple locations. How do you manage the stakeholders? I mean, maybe rather than us trying to dissect the world of change management in 2 minutes or whatever we've got left, maybe just sort of summarize, how do you get started on that change management journey, or what are some of the things to think about?
Well, for starters, from the beginning. I mean, that's you get started on that like now. And I think in both instances, the key there is going to be communication. So a communication plan in both instances are critical. Whether you're talking about managing kind of that digital transformation, or you're sort of talking about managing stakeholders. What is the communication window for this across people? Because that's really what people are looking for on these complicated projects. We used to call them suits. Now everything's virtual, but when the suits will come through the door, these consultants that are implementing, I was a suit, right? You kind of walk through the door, everyone's looking at you sideways. Like, why are you here? What are you doing? And if no one's communicating with them, they got all kind of weirdness running through their head. They want to do this. Oh, this was Gary. Gary did this to me. Gary is sort of pushing his agenda, and all this craziness is sort of starts to bubble up in the organization, and that's where all these misunderstandings start to come from. So they need a communication path. How are we going to talk to them? How are they going to be able to share information with us? How are we going to share information with them? What is the cadence going to be like for engaging our end users that ultimately we'll need, but we just don't need right now at this stage of the project? Likewise, stakeholders that we need right now. What is that cadence going to look like? How frequently are we going to meet? Where are we going to meet? What are we going to sort of talk about? What is their visibility going to be into this particular project? Risk, as well as the success. And so to me, in both cases, that comes down to having an appropriate communication plan. Everyone thinks about OCM from the perspective of training, and they should. It's a critical part of it. But there's other factors to change management. And I think one of the critical parts to change management, aside from the branding elements and just making sure that there's positive energy around your project, and you identifying resistance in problematic areas. But that communication plan for me is a critical part of having a successful project across the board and having a successful alignment with your people.
Yeah, yeah, well said. And we could spend a whole hour on change management. We have done that before, by the way, but we'll do that some other time too. But there are, one last point, closing thought I'll leave with the audience here. If you want more in the realm of change management, if you go to our website, which is thirdstage-consulting.com, go to the top to the resource center, and within the resource center, there's a guide to change management that provides a ton of best practices and lessons, and just kind of really breaks down change management, all the different components that you should be thinking about. So I encourage you to check that out. And one other thought too that I didn't mention before is if you're looking for a career shift, and I know especially for those of you that ask questions around working for a smaller firm, we're constantly hiring and recruiting and talking to people, trying to find our next team members as we grow as a company at Third Stage. So if you go to work at thirdstage-consulting.com, that's obviously an email address and not a website, but if you email work at thirdstage-consulting.com, you can submit your resume to us that way, and our team will take a look at that. So I want to just make sure that point is out there too. And then last but not least, I figure this is a good closing comment from Sam Graham, who's one of our more active social media engagers with us. This old dog is learning a lot of new tricks. Thanks, Eric. So that makes two of us. I'm learning a lot too. I've learned a lot here with you today, Khalid. So thank you for being here. Really appreciate your time, and thank you to the audience for their time, for all the great questions on all the platforms. You'll find this interview polished up and edited, and it'll look prettier in the official podcast that comes out a week from tomorrow, a week from Wednesday. So be sure to check that out. It's Transformation Ground Control Podcast. You can find that on all the whatever platform you're watching on now. Find it on the audio podcast platforms as well. So thanks for being here, Khalid. Really appreciate your time, and thank you everyone for being here, and hope you all have a great day. We'll see you soon, and be sure to check us out next Tuesday for our next live stream as well. All right, thanks everyone.
All right, thanks for having me.
All right, thanks, Khalid.
Bye.
Bye.